and welcome to The Dungeon. I'm your host Rob, and here on this channel we discuss all things related to Dungeons and Dragons. Today's video we're going to be talking about building your own campaign world, and I like to take inspiration from a lot of different sources, so I'm going to be talking about that kind of stuff as well. And a lot of what I do is to take other people's ideas and just kind of make them mine. And this is something I've talked about in a lot of my videos. It really is a theme through pretty much everything I design or do. So to give you a basic idea of what we're going to be talking about, I'm currently running a campaign of my own setting, my own devising, and most of we just call it the Whitespire campaign, named after the city where the players all started. That's kind of where they all came together and where they're basically based out of. So I had an idea of what I wanted the city to be like. I wanted my campaign world to be like, in fact, and I wanted kind of a little more low magic than the traditional D&D setting, but not like Conan levels of low magic. So like higher than Conan, but lower than the Forgotten Realms. Somewhere in that setting type there. So that was the original idea I had. I came up with a brief history of the main city and how it had been founded by an order of paladins who'd actually come to rescue this army of dwarves. And the dwarves were basically being rather prideful and stubborn, had been very slow to ask for help. They were fighting this massive army of orcs and goblins and even some dark elves. But when they were finally brought basically to the brink of extinction, they reached out for help from this human empire, and the empire said no. But one of the grand leaders of the lawful good god of Dawnblast decided that he would get all of the paladins and all the faithful of the church, and they rode forth to go help the dwarves. And they only had like 800 members, but every single one of them was a paladin or a cleric of Dawnblast. And they arrived in time to help save the dwarves and turn the tide of battle. And famously, the leader of the paladins and the dwarven king, they stood side by side and slew the orc leader who'd managed to unite all these different orc tribes under his banner. And it really was the last one who'd done that, and that was like 800 years ago. And so that was the basic concept. I knew that the dwarves, in honor of this, had decided to build the city for the humans to live at, because the humans were now kind of outlawed in the empire. So from this, I basically knew that there was going to be a bunch of dwarves in the city as well, and that the humans and the dwarves relation was going to be kind of a pretty fundamental thing. In fact, I decided some different traditions basically later on from this idea, including that the dwarves would always have one member of the royal family who would stay in Whitespire. And that didn't necessarily mean they were an important member. It might be like a second cousin or something like that, but somebody related to the king would always live there. And usually you could tell how good relations were by how closely they were related. So at this point, when the players are playing, like 800 years after the city was first built and established, the dwarf king's son was actually there, and the players were able to help rescue him. So I knew that the dwarves and the humans, that was kind of the foundation. I also knew that they'd been started by an order of lawful good paladins, but I didn't want the city itself to necessarily be entirely good. I kind of felt like over time things had kind of started to fall apart as far as that sense, but there was still this authoritarian lawful presence in the city that was very strong. And so this kind of took the place of this like authoritarian top-down pressure to control magic and things like that. And this would be one of the reasons why there was less magic or lower magic in this setting. I still wanted players to be able to play wizards and warlocks and clerics and druids and everything else. I didn't want to strict player choices as far as characters they could make or what spells they could take or anything like that. But I knew that in a city where magic was going to be regulated and you'd have to have a license to practice magic, this also meant that the nobles wouldn't want people being able to just go into your local store and buy a bunch of magic items. You weren't going to be able to go buy a Vorpal sword if you had enough money, or a bunch of scrolls. All this kind of stuff was going to have to be policed and regulated. And this would help to kind of set the lower level of magic that I was looking for. So with this basic concept in mind, I started looking at different story elements and different ways that I was going to start to create my city. Now, I like to use a lot of other people's stuff. I'm a big believer in taking third-party materials and just kind of incorporating them or reskinning them and adapting them into my stuff. And that was no different with my city settings either. And I think one thing that can be really intimidating to a lot of dungeon masters when they're trying to look at an urban campaign or an urban setting is that they have this idea that they need to know every NPC and every building, and they need to have the names of every street and every back alley, and they need to know all the different guilds and who's in them. They need to know all the thieves guilds and who's in them. And I'm not saying that it's not good to have a lot of that kind of prep work ready, but you don't need to have everything, especially not at the start, because the truth is your players are generally going to go back to the same people over and over again, as long as those NPCs aren't complete jerks. So if the players decide, hey, we want to go get a drink somewhere, where is there? Is there a tavern or anything close by? And you're like, sure. And then the players go there, they meet the people that are there. They're just going to go back to there again the next time, as long as they got along well, as long as they didn't get into trouble and NPCs treated them well. They're just going to go back there. And if they need a blacksmith and, the paladin buys plate mail off some guy, well, later, if he's like, oh, hey, now I got this magic plate mail, but I kind of want to get it personalized. Can I get like a bunch of, like stuff engraved on it or embossed on it or whatever? And you'd be like, sure, I bet the blacksmith could do that for you. They're just going to go back to that same guy. You don't need 47 different blacksmiths. You don't need 123 different bars and taverns or whatever. If you have just one or two per district, you maybe have like the high class one and the low class one. You have the nice one, you have the seedy one, and maybe you have one in between. And you just have a few of these per district, then no matter where the players are, they're going to be able to go to those places and find them. And they're just going to go back there the next time anyways. And this is held true at every gaming table and really in every gaming system I've ever played in. The players, they're like the guys from Cheers. They just want to go where everybody knows their name. And that's where they're going to feel comfortable. And they're going to get to know those NPCs. And you don't need to have lists of thousands and thousands and thousands of NPCs in a giant city. You just don't. And you don't need to have all the streets named either. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So I kind of had this concept, like I say, I was going to have my kind of low magic world. I wanted to have less gods because that's one of my big complaints about the Forgotten Realms is there's just so many gods. Now I kind of broke my own rule on this, but I'll talk about that in a second. But my first original concept was, what if I just had one god of each alignment? And that would make my pantheon of gods. And I'd just call them the 9. And, so you'd have your lawful good one, your neutral good, chaotic good, etc., right? And then all the evil ones, neutral ones, whatever. And this would be my pantheon. Now, I kind of liked the idea that there might be other gods outside the pantheon as well, but that the 9 wouldn't necessarily like that. And so a lot of these other religions would just be considered like cults, and they'd be like heretical orders. And of course, where there's heretics, you need somebody to hunt the heretics. So this gave rise to my idea of the Inquisition. The Inquisition were paladins and clerics from all of the 9 gods who formed a secret order devoted to hunting down the heretics. Now, obviously, they're not united by alignment because you have chaotic evil paladins and lawful good paladins and true neutral paladins all working together. But they are bound by the belief in their pantheon of gods, and that's what unifies the Inquisition. But there's also different factions within the Inquisition, something my players haven't really noticed yet, but now any of them watching this video will now realize that there's different factions within the Inquisition. Because of course there is. You have lawful good and chaotic evil people trying to work together. That causes strife. So a lot of these ideas started coming basically though from my core concept, which is just that I'm going to have a low magic setting, or lower magic. It's not really true low magic, but a lower magic setting. And I'm going to have a limited number of gods, or at least a limited number of recognized, legally accepted gods. And that this would then give rise to other ideas. And so already I was starting to come up with ideas of other gods that maybe aren't recognized or aren't legally, accessible. I also knew that because it was going to be more of a low magic setting, that players were going to have magic licenses if they wanted to practice magic within the city. and that these things were going to be regulated and overseen, and that this would doubtless give rise to bureaucrats and other government agents. And so it started to take this form of like one entire district of my city is just basically lawyers in charge of just stupid mundane things. And the idea that it was a city built on lawful principles ahead of good principles also kind of fit that same idea, that everything was going to be kind of regulated and there were just going to be meaningless laws. And like, there's an actual guild I have in my city of referees for legal duels. And they, you have to use like weapons of a certain make, or have to be recognized by the legal authorities, and you have to both sign that you're participating in this duel of your own free will and whatnot. And so like even killing other guys is just not necessarily an easy thing if you want to do it, because it's like, well, yeah, you can kill somebody and then you're going to go to prison, unless you have a legal duel, in which case you both also have to pay a fee to pay for the referee. So this kind of gave rise to a lot of other like weird little concepts that all started to take a life of their own. But I don't want to get too distracted with a lot of that. I mentioned third-party stuff, and I think it's really important to have your own concept of what your setting or whatever is going to be like before you start incorporating a bunch of other stuff. Because otherwise, and no disrespect to the Forgotten Realms, I like the Forgotten Realms, but otherwise you end up with a setting where people just try to fit everything into one setting. And I think that's really the case here. You look at places like Chult, and then you look at like Waterdeep, and it's hard to believe that these two things even exist in the same game world, because they're so like over the top ridiculous opposites of one another. And that's not to say that you can't make it work. I'm just saying that they don't seem like a very unified game world in some cases. And again, I don't mean that as a shot at Forgotten Realms. I mean, the Forgotten Realms is the most successful Dungeons and Dragons setting there is, and obviously there's reasons for that. So I'm not trying to insult it. I'm just saying that when you're making your own stuff, you might want to have kind of a little more unifying idea. And that's not to say you can't branch out from there. I'll talk about some stuff in a second as well. So I had my basic setting, I had my basic idea. Now I wanted to start trying to, bring it to life and start giving it more form. I had concepts, but I didn't really have the city to apply them to yet. So I started making White Spire. And like I said, I found a couple different sources that really helped to shape and bring the city to life. And one of them, the first one I'll talk about, was a product called The Blight by Richard Pett and published by Frog God Games. And I love Frog God Games. They are an amazing third-party group who just make excellent stuff for Dungeons & Dragons. And I love their products. In fact, you can buy The Blight from their website if you're interested. But Richard Pett did a bunch of stuff for Pathfinder as well. And I've never really played Pathfinder, so I wasn't familiar with this stuff. But everybody seems to love this guy. And after looking at some of his adventure paths, I can see why. Because he is a master of writing horror Dungeons & Dragons stuff. Horror D&D. I love it. And he is excellent at that kind of stuff. So apparently we're haunted. Anyways, so I started looking through a bunch of his stuff, and The Blight is about a city called Casterhague. And the best way to describe Casterhague would be like, picture Jack the Ripper era London with magic. That's probably the best I can do. And it was a fascinating place. It's really dark and dismal and dreary, and just everything is terrible there. Unfortunately, that wasn't quite what I was looking for. I wanted to have some of those elements, but I didn't want the whole city to be dark and dreary and depressing. I mean, as much as they may have strayed from the path, the city was founded by an order of paladins devoted to a lawful good god who wanted to make this great place. And it was established in unity with these dwarves that they'd helped save. And so I wanted to kind of stick true to my original idea. Otherwise, I could just be running it in The Blight. And that wasn't what I was trying to do either. But it did have a lot of great elements and a lot of great themes and moods that I was able to incorporate. And that's more what I'm looking for. I'm looking for themes and mood and ideas, not necessarily the actual setting. But the Blight also gave me the kind of basic geography that my city would end up taking. And I used a bunch of the districts from it, and that kind of was the birth of the original concept of the city. The second main source I used was Monte Cook's Tallus, which, for anybody familiar with that, you probably realize that was the setting that he created to rules test 3rd edition D&D. Now, I never played 3rd edition either because I'd stopped at 2nd edition, and that's when I started playing Vampire and a bunch of other games, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and whatnot. So, to me, I had to do a lot of research on this because I didn't really know who the guy was, and I didn't really know anything about the city. And Tallus was kind of like the opposite of the Blight. It was super high magic. You'd have like wizards flying around on flying carpets and stuff. And again, because I already knew I wanted more of a low magic setting, this wasn't what I was looking for either. But the history of that world was absolutely fascinating. And while I had the history of a city, I didn't have the history of my world yet. And so a lot of the elements from this, I had a few big things. I knew there were a race of primordials that were kind of like the Greek Titans that had existed before the gods, and that a lot of the world had taken its shape after the war between the primordials and the gods, where the gods were victorious. But I also knew my primordials were more powerful than the gods on like a one-on-one basis. It's just that they were outnumbered like 10 to 1. And I kind of had this idea that the primordials, rather than being kind of humanoid like the Greek Titans were, they were kind of more like creatures, right? Like picture like the Midgardian serpent and the Fenris wolf from Norse mythology. And that was kind of more the influence from the primordials. They were just more gigantic, monstrous beasts of godlike power, or even beyond godlike power, because they tended to be even more powerful than the gods were. But the difference was that the primordials were kind of uninterested in the races and people they created, whereas the gods actually got power from their worshippers. And I liked the idea that this is why people, make clerics and whatnot, and why you have religious orders, because their faith and their devotion, the sacrifices they make, give the gods power. And in return, the gods grant spells to their worshippers, which then allows them to perform miracles and increases more people's faith and helps them to convert to the religion. And then they begin to worship that god. And so the gods draw their power from their mortal worshippers, which explains why, at least in my D&D world, why they have a much closer relationship than, say in a lot of other settings. So I liked a lot of the timeline, the history, and a lot of the elements from there I thought were really interesting. And that helped to shape the greater world beyond it. And again, because I kind of knew what stuff I liked and what I was looking for, I was able to take the stuff that fit in and throw out the stuff that didn't. I didn't want to have a high magic setting with wizards flying around with flying carpets and all sorts of other stuff like that. And that's great for a different setting. It just wasn't what I was looking for. And so, because I already had my core concept of what I wanted the game to be and what I wanted the world to be like, I was able to say, this fits, this fits, this fits, this stuff doesn't. And when you have that kind of concept, it's very easy to start being able to adapt a lot of stuff and fit it into your game world. And it becomes yours in a way. And I know it sounds weird when I'm talking about taking somebody else's stuff, but the truth is that when you take something else and you adapt it to your world, now you have to start thinking about how it fits in. And that act causes you to start shaping your world around those ideas, which means that you don't have to keep going to a book. This is the thing I find running my own stuff versus running somebody else's. When I'm running a published setting, I feel like when the player's going to some place I don't know, I have to look that place up, and now I have to know who's there, and I have to figure out everything about that person. Or I have to at least remember what it is by looking it up again. But when it's yours, you don't really have to worry about that. You can either just make it up on the fly, which you could do in both cases, but just the fact that you're running a published thing and that there's a stat block and there's a description in the book of this kind of makes you feel like you need to look it up. But when it's yours, you don't have that obligation. You're just like, oh yeah, I haven't done anything with that yet. I'll just make it up now and then that becomes part of the game world. And then usually if I'm doing that kind of stuff, I just make a note on it and I write it down. I write down the name of the place. I write down the NPC. I might put a note next to them for their alignment if I've decided what that is yet. And that's really all you have to worry about. And then as the players go back there, then it starts to take on more of a life of its own. And the players are the ones who actually help to breathe that life into it, because they start trying to interact with those NPCs. And then you have to figure out how those NPCs react. And that's the collaborative part of the storytelling, where, now it's not just something in a book, it's something that you and your players have created together. And then it sticks in your mind way more. And you don't have to always look it up, because it's now just yours and it's part of your game world. Well, at least that's what I find anyway. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with taking notes on this kind of stuff. But after you start, doing this a lot, you'll start finding that it just starts to like become part of your nature almost, where you're like, yeah, this is going to fit in here, and this is going to fit in here, and this is going to be part of this. Anyways, moving on still. So I liked a lot of the world history from Talos. I liked a lot of the feeling and atmosphere of the Blight. And then the third product, which was way less influential in the city, but was a big part of my philosophy and concept in a lot of the games I've run, is Vornheim, the Complete City Kit. And this is where I first discovered the idea that you really don't have to have everything mapped out. You don't need to know the name of every street and alley. I didn't really use anything from Vornheim itself, because he has the entire city detailed. And Vornheim's a cool setting, but it's really like weird and whimsical and strange. And it definitely wasn't the feeling I was looking for at all. But it has some excellent random tables, which are very helpful, because no matter how creative you might think you are, sometimes random tables are just the best things you can have, because you don't get trapped in your typical lines of thought. You can, I don't even necessarily roll on the table sometimes, or sometimes I'll roll and then I don't like the result, but I'll look at like the one above it or the one below it and I'm like, ooh, that's kind of cool. And then I take that. But the point is, it gives you different things that you weren't necessarily thinking of on your own, and it can inspire you to go in different directions. Another thing that Vornheim had was a quick and easy form of mapping on the fly, where you just use dice rolls, and I really liked that. It's kind of complicated to explain, but once you see it in practice, it's really easy. So that was kind of cool as well. And really just the idea that you can make things up on a spur of the moment and it's going to be okay. A lot of that idea really was cemented to me from reading through Vornheim. And it's something I've kind of always done in the past a bit, but you're always kind of like, I should probably know what I'm doing more, or I should probably have stats for this stuff. And really, you don't need that. If you do, you can probably do it at that time anyways. Because the truth is that if you are trying to write a story, then you're not really playing Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of what I do is to have major plot events in a story, but then how we get there and how we go from one to the next is up to the players and the decisions that they make. So I'll talk about more about that in a second. I just want to finish up my thoughts on the actual city building. But yeah, basically I had my own idea. I took the parts from different settings that I liked. I left out the stuff that didn't really fit, and the parts that inspired me to come up with different ideas or change things, then we just change. And that's fine too, right? You might think that you want something, but then when you read something else, you're like, oh, and it gets you thinking along a different line of thought, or maybe it makes your original idea even stronger or better, or maybe you start realizing the original idea isn't maybe as cool as you thought it was, or maybe it's more limited in scope, and it might be better for a one-shot than an actual campaign, and that's fine too, and just run a one-shot. Anyways, I wanted to talk a little bit about the major plot points idea, and again, this is the kind of thing, I draw inspiration from basically everywhere. I read a lot of books, I take stuff from movies, I take things from other role-playing games. I've adapted different adventures from Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing to D&D. I even adapted when I was running Shadowrun. I took a Vampire the Masquerade story that I'd played and adapted it to the Shadowrun universe. You know, like if you're if you're willing to just like make some changes and work with the story, then you can probably adapt almost anything to anything else. Just reskin it and change it around and figure out where would this fit in my world. So one of the things that the players ended up doing is they encountered this goblin clown type creature that was heavily inspired by the creature from It, because I love It. And so I knew the players were going to end up fighting this guy at some point, and it wasn't going to be till like level 10ish because he was fairly powerful. And so the players, were doing other things, but eventually I knew at some point they're going to be hired by one of these NPCs they've met in the past to find all these missing children that have been taken by the clown. So the players ended up doing that. I also knew that I quite liked I've read in Pleasant Land from Lamentations of the Flame Princess. And I mentioned this in a video before. It's kind of like Alice in Wonderland meets Dracula, but it was more heavy on the whimsical, weird Alice stuff than on the Dracula stuff. And I like the Dracula stuff more. So, as I always do, I just kind of took what I liked and threw at the other stuff. But anyways, in the Blight, there's this like world he just calls in between. And it's like this weird fairy realm in between different worlds. And it's not really explained, but that's okay. It's not really meant to be. And I really like that concept. But I wanted to mix it with A Red and Pleasant Land. So when the players defeated the clown, instead of coming back into their own world, they get sucked into this portal and they get deposited on this beach in this other world. And I'd kind of set this other world up as well, because one of the players had seen through a mirror once where somebody had gone through this mirror, and when the player went there, it was just a mirror. But for a moment, he saw this other land with like this dull red sun above it in the sky. And so when the players come here, they realize that's what they are. And they meet this captain, and well, they actually met the helmsman first, and his brother, who's his identical twin but is blind. And these two were kind of inspired by Michael Moorcock's characters from the Elric books. And basically the role of the captain and his brother is that they're like this manifestation of the will of mankind, and they gather heroes from different worlds and use these heroes to try to like save humanity, right, in the books. And that's a little more grand than I wanted these guys to be. Basically, these guys were just a captain and his brother and their crew who were trying to gather up the heroes of their land and gather them together to fight the Red King's armies at this old abandoned decayed castle called Light's Hope. And so he is informed by the seer that they need to be at this place at this time. They're going to find these heroes, and that's when the players come through. So they gather them. They get some other heroes as well. They go to Light's Hope. And the Battle of Light's Hope was kind of inspired by a comic book I'd read called Fables. And there was an issue called The Last Castle that I really, really loved. But in Fables, it's like Alice in Wonderland and Cinderella and the Three Blind Mice and, Jack and the Beanstalk and all that kind of stuff, right? And I didn't really want to use that stuff, but it kind of fit the whole Alice in Wonderland whimsy type of idea from this world to begin with. So I was like, well, maybe I could just replace those with, instead of using Robin Hood and Cinderella, I'll use my own characters. And one of the things, I made up a bunch of NPCs for the heroes of this land. And then I also, while going through the Creature Codex, which is like a third-person monster manual from Kobold Press, they had a bunch of animal lords. So there's like the Mouse King and the Cat Queen and the Serpent Queen and like the Monkey King and the Bat King and all these other animal gods, well, not really gods, but animal lords. And that really seemed to fit the whole like Alice in Wonderland type thing, right? That you had like a bunch of non-magical mice that were just normal mice, but you also had a Mouse King and his followers who were like sentient and could speak, and they were like bigger than regular mice, And I kind of liked that idea. So those ended up being some of the big defenders from the battle as well. And really, like I said, it was a combination of my own ideas plus this comic book that I'd read, plus everything else. And then how the battle actually went was really up to the players, because they were going to have to devise their strategy of how to fight the Red King. And I mentioned in a different video, they ended up taking the rowboat from the captain and his brother's boat and sailed up the coast and came in behind and tried to assassinate the Red King from behind. Ended up having to fight the Iron Legion, which was like his personal bodyguard of ghouls and whatnot. But eventually we were able to destroy the Red King and help save the day. And a bunch of the heroes of the land died, but that's all right. It had given us some good opportunities for role play, and a bunch of them got to establish. And it also gave me a chance to give the players some better items, because some of these NPCs that they'd made friends with had left these items to them, or members of their clan or whatever had decided, hey, you know, I think they'd want to have this kind of thing. So it allowed me to gear the players up, but also have some meaningful NPC deaths, because these were people that they'd actually like met and had interacted with and fought beside and whatnot. And all of this was basically like just out there in my mind that, like, yeah, around level 10 or 11 or so, this stuff is going to happen. But how we get there is going to be up to the players, and how they deal with it is going to be up to the players. One of the other major things was, when I first designed the 9, my pantheon of 9 gods, the chaotic evil goddess was actually Tiamat. And I didn't use Bahamut as the lawful good god, because I just didn't want like a bunch of the gods to all be dragons. But I also thought, you know, you can't really have Bahamut and not have Tiamat, or vice versa. So I always knew Bahamut had to be out there somewhere. And so I had this idea that maybe he existed in my world, but he'd been like locked away and imprisoned somewhere. And so when Jaden was making his character, he decided he wanted to make a dragonborn Path of the Zealot barbarian. And so he'd actually called me and was like, hey, I'm thinking of making this dragonborn barbarian who worships Bahamut. But Troy told me that, you know, you have only limited specific gods in your world, and Bahamut might not be one of them, so I should call you first. And so he told me his kind of backstory, that his character had actually been executed, but he'd, you know, heard the voice of Bahamut and had come back to life again, and now was like sworn to serve Bahamut. And I was like, man, that's a cool idea. And I kind of liked the idea that, you know, even though he's in prison, Bahamut had managed to reach out and make contact with this guy, and had chosen him to be his champion, in the hopes that one day his champion will be able to find him and rescue him. And now, something that hadn't been a big deal at all, it's just in my head, it's like, yeah, Bahamut's out there, but he's locked away somewhere. I don't have to worry about it. He just exists, and that's all I need to know. Well, suddenly I needed to know a lot more. I needed to know where he was imprisoned. I needed to know how and who had imprisoned him, and who wants to still keep him imprisoned. And also, who might want him freed, but might not necessarily be an ally to the player. Like, who maybe wants to use this for their own benefits. And so from this, which is the player deciding, hey, I want to worship this one god, all these other ideas started coming together. And I'm not going to get too much into the deal with this yet, so we're going to start hitting spoiler territory if I don't shut up. But they already know Bahamut's been locked away, and that he's in this place called the Citadel of Seven Chains, and that they have to find him and free him. And so this has all been like story stuff that came about because one player decided, hey, can I worship this god? And I have this kind of interesting backstory on how it happened, kind of thing. And I find that usually if you know what your story is, or if you know what the feeling or the mood is going to be, then it starts getting really easy to say this fits and this doesn't. And then it starts becoming a lot easier to kind of shape your world the way you want it to go, and to have like a coherent theme or idea. And that's really what I'm looking to do. I have like different continents in the same game world, but they also have like completely different like themes or feels, but they still exist within the same game world. So like one of the lands the players haven't even been to yet is more of a like actual Conan the Barbarian type feel, right? There's no real empires or anything. There's a bunch of city states. There's a lot of like just barbarian type tribes. People don't really like there are churches to the 9 gods in this continent as well, but a lot of people do not worship them. They all worship like weird other types of gods. But the Inquisition doesn't really have a lot of power here because they're mostly based in the other continent, right? And so these other gods have been allowed to flourish, and a lot of them aren't necessarily good. So, like I say, if you have your theme and your idea, then it starts getting very easy to see this is going to fit and this doesn't. So I want to talk a little bit about the actual sources of inspiration that I usually draw from. And I've mentioned a couple of these already, like books, comic books, movies are all big. Other game systems is a big one. But another one, which a lot of players might not necessarily think about, or dungeon masters for that matter, might not immediately think about, and that is art. I will often just Google like fantasy landscapes or fantasy art, or look for like different character images or whatever, and save a bunch of this stuff in different files on my computer. And just looking at different like fantasy art will often inspire different ideas. And the thing I think is really interesting about it is it's turned out that I've taken art from like other game systems entirely without even realizing it, just because I'm like, oh, that's a cool picture. It turns out it's from some other book. But because you aren't being influenced by the book, you're just being influenced by the art. When you look at it, you're going to have your own idea of what this picture is and what this image is. And it's going to evoke thoughts and maybe story elements or ideas for you without any sort of like other like taint, I guess I'll call it, for lack of a better word. And this allows you to really start shaping like your own thoughts and images in your head of where this is going to go and what kind of places could be inspired by this. Like I had a city, this basically a city of necromancers that was inspired by just some cool pictures I saw of like this like dead city with all these like skeleton and zombie workers in it and stuff. And I was like, that's kind of interesting. What if I had a city that was run by necromancers and they used undead as like slave labor essentially? And that gave birth to this entire city, you know? And that's been a major part of Troy's story arc, has so far been trying to find and apprentice himself to this one great necromancer dude, and kind of like following the trail of where he's gone in order to catch up to him, type of thing. And one of the places Troy's gone now is that city. And a bunch of the some of like the dark forests and dark elements of my world have all been shaped by like looking at different art and images. And especially I found some like really interesting, weird, like Lovecraftian type stuff that started influencing like different cults that the players would fight against and things like that. And so I really want to stress that, you know, as much as you can get like good story elements from other ideas and combine them with your own ideas, a lot of times just looking to be inspired by something, art is one of the best sources you can find. Just Google a bunch of fantasy images and look at them, and just whatever like comes into your mind when you look at those, you just start thinking like, man, that's awesome. Where could I fit that in my game world? And as long as your world is, you know, big and interesting enough, you'll probably be able to find places for it. So I think I'm going to finish the video there. I probably rambled more than I wanted to, but that's all right. Hopefully there was something in here that you'll like and pick out little gems here and there, and, you know, not have wasted your time. But feel free to like the video if you liked it. If you didn't, that's fine too. And, you know, hit the notification bell and whatnot. And I will see you next time in the dungeon.